On my granddaughter's birthday, amidst the crowd's laughter and conversation, my son tugged my sleeve 4 times. I suddenly realized it was the old signal, the secret code we hadn't used in 20 years. And when we met to ask about that signal, my son revealed a truth that shocked me to the point of collapse. That truth contained the crimes of a devil who had been perfectly disguised for years. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen. Before we go any further, I'd love for you to drop a quick comment and tell me where are you watching from right now. Certain details have been adjusted for storytelling and educational purposes. The message is what I hope stays with you. The moment my son tugged my jacket sleeve, I didn't look at his face. I looked at my watch. 3:14 p.m., marking the exact second my retirement ended and my instincts took the wheel. I am Thane Garrison, 66 years old, and after 28 years wearing a badge for the Oregon State Police, I thought I'd seen every mask a monster could wear. Usually retirement in Portland meant tending to the cedar deck and keeping the squirrels off the bird feeder. But the pressure on my bicep was a code I hadn't forgotten. It was the frantic, rhythmic pulse of a man who was drowning while standing on dry land. My son, Corbin Garrison, is 32 and works as a draftsman carrying a weight of past mistakes that makes him far too eager to believe in second chances. He stood beside me near the gift table, the air thick with the smell of grilled chicken and the high-pitched chaos of Ria's second birthday party. He gave my sleeve a sharp, insistent tug, his eyes darting toward the center of the yard. I looked over and saw that the party wasn't just a celebration. It was a carefully staged networking event. Standing by the grill was Briar, my daughter-in-law of 3 years, a 34-year-old who specialized in a specific kind of boutique investment that always seemed to favor the house. She was holding court with our most affluent neighbors, the Millers and the Kensingtons, her posture perfect and her smile as bright as the expensive Chardonnay glinting in her glass. I took a slow sip of my own drink, the oaky finish doing nothing to settle the sudden vibration in my gut. You spend 30 years hunting wolves and you start to smell the iron in their blood before they even open their mouths. I watched Briar gesture toward a glossy prospectus on the patio table, her voice carrying just enough to reach me over the sound of children laughing. Corbin's fingers tugged my sleeve for the second time, a desperate, silent plea for intervention that he couldn't vocalize. I saw the way Briar leaned in toward Mr. Miller, her expression one of practiced intimacy. She was talking about a limited intake window, a phrase that usually precedes a financial shearing. I moved closer, my analytical mind cataloging the scene with the cold precision of a crime scene investigator. Briar noticed my approach and didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head and invited me into the circle with a wave of her hand. Then she said it, the word that made my skin crawl. She looked Mr. Miller in the eye and described the Cascade Fund as a vehicle for frictionless capital. My internal database flared to life. Frictionless capital was a specific predatory term used by a fraud ring I had investigated 5 years ago in the Medford district, a group that left a trail of emptied 401s and broken retirees in their wake. Corbin tugged my sleeve a third time, his face pale against the afternoon sun. I realized then that my son wasn't just nervous. He was terrified. The warmth of the May afternoon suddenly felt like the heat from an interrogation lamp. I adjusted my posture, the old authoritative weight returning to my shoulders as I locked eyes with the woman my son had married. She smiled at me, a perfect diamond heart expression, and I realized I wasn't just a father-in-law at a party. I was a target being measured for the kill. I watched the wine in Briar's glass swirl a pale, expensive amber while my son tugged my sleeve with the strength of a man who was drowning in clear water. That predatory smile she wore didn't just target the neighbors. It was a net closing around my entire family tree. Corbin didn't say a word, but the message in his grip was loud enough to rattle my teeth. I allowed him to guide me away from the laughter and the clinking silverware, moving toward the weathered cedar fence at the back of the property, where the damp smell of mulch and cedar offered a thin veil of privacy. We reached the shadow of the tall laurel hedge, and that was when he did it. He delivered the fourth tug on my sleeve, a sharp, rhythmic, and desperate pull that bypassed my brain and went straight to my adrenaline. "Don't look back, Dad." He muttered, his voice strained as if he were holding back a physical weight. Just walk with me. I stopped and turned to him, my voice dropping into that low-level frequency I used when a perimeter had been breached. I felt it, Corbin. I said, I'm here. Tell me. He swallowed hard. His pupils dilated so wide they nearly swallowed the blue of his irises. Dad. She already moved a check. He whispered the words, tumbling out in a rush. A pre-allocation check from our joint account. She didn't even wait for my final signature. She just took it. The air in my lungs turned to cold lead. My mind, usually a fortress of calm analysis, suddenly felt the static of the party fade into a singular piercing frequency. How many fathers spend 20 years building a bridge of trust only to watch a stranger set it on fire with a smile and a glass of Chardonnay? The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was a total violation of the sanctuary I had tried to build for him. My memory involuntarily jerked back to a Christmas dinner in 1999. Corbin was 7, trapped in a corner by my brother, Uncle Vernon, a man who could discuss the intricacies of municipal sewage systems until the sun went down. Corbin's eyes had been glassed over then, the same way they were now, to save him from social exhaustion without causing a family rift. I had invented the code. 3 tugs on the sleeve meant the exit door was open and I was coming to get him. We hadn't used it since his freshman year of college yet. Here it was resurfacing like a flare launched from a sinking ship. The memory of that 1999 Christmas wasn't a soft blanket. It was a whetstone sharpening my resolve until it hummed with a dangerous edge. I looked at my son, seeing the 32-year-old man who was still in this moment, that vulnerable boy in the corner. It's worse than the money, Dad, he continued, his voice a jagged whisper that cut through the rhythmic hiss of the nearby sprinklers. She's been coaching Rhea. She's teaching a 2-year-old to repeat phrases about investment growth and the Cascade Fund when she's around you. She's using the baby to soften you up. The taste of metallic adrenaline flooded my mouth. I looked back toward the house, seeing Briar's silhouette through the sliding glass door. She isn't waiting for me to say yes anymore. Dad, Corbin said, his hand finally dropping from my arm. She's already started the transfer. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a crime, a heavy hollow ringing in the ears that only those who have carried a badge truly recognize. As the last of the guests trickled out and the backyard gate clicked shut, that silence settled over my home like a shroud. Corbin had left with Briar, his face a mask of artificial composure that didn't fool me for a second. His revelation about the unauthorized transfer was a jagged hook in my gut, pulling tighter with every breath. I stood in the kitchen, the smell of leftover birthday cake mingling with the sterile scent of dish soap as the dishwasher began its rhythmic hum. My wife, Alara, a retired principal who could read a student's lie from across a crowded gym, was already watching Briar with a stillness that mirrored my own. She didn't ask what Corbin said near the fence. She already knew. Thane, she said, her voice low as she stacked the remaining plates. You saw it, too, didn't you? That look in her eyes when the neighbors mentioned their trust funds. It wasn't interest. It was an inventory. I nodded, the weight of my linen shirt feeling like lead. He used the signal. Ilara, 4 times. He's terrified. He told me she's already initiated a transfer from their joint account without his consent. Ilara stopped, the plate still in her hand. She told me something else while we were clearing the snack table. She found a hidden voice recorder app active on Briar's phone earlier today. Briar had left it face down near where we were sitting. She wasn't just joining the family. She was documenting us. Marriage is a partnership of trust, but when that trust is weaponized, it becomes a slow-acting poison that kills the heart before the victim even feels the sting. We moved through the cleanup in a shared protective trance. By midnight, the house was finally dark, but sleep was a ghost I couldn't catch. The sound of the rain against the glass started as a light tapping, growing into a steady, mournful rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock. At 11:47 p.m, my phone vibrated on the nightstand, the sudden buzz making my skin prickle. It was a text from Corbin. I can't wait until the weekend. I'm coming over at 7 o'clock. Please don't tell Briar. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the glass. Whatever she started. Corbin. We're ending it tomorrow, I replied. I retreated to my study, the air here smelling of old paper and the cold metal desk I'd used for 3 decades of casework. The blue light of my phone screen felt like a cold blade in the dark as I logged into my home security interface. I needed to see if the perimeter of my digital life was as breached as Corbin's. My fingers moved with a muscle memory I hadn't used in years. Scrolling through the remote access logs, my blood turned to ice. There were dozens of entries over the last 3 weeks. Remote logins to my office computer using Corbin's credentials, occurring at hours I knew my son was asleep. Briar hadn't just been raiding his savings. She had been using his access to mine my own files, my history, and my private financial records. I stared at the security log, my pulse hammering in my throat, as I realized Briar wasn't just after Corbin's savings. She was already deep inside my own financial life. The predator wasn't at the gates. She was already in the vault. I was on my third cup of black coffee when the headlights of Corbin's truck swept across the kitchen wall. Not the steady approach of a man coming home, but the jerky, frantic path of someone running for his life. The discovery from the night before that Briar had been hollowing out my digital privacy while I slept had left me with a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth that no amount of caffeine could wash away. I opened the back door before he even reached the porch. The gray Portland dawn was breaking through a relentless cold rain that turned the yard into a blur of charcoal and slate. Corbin stumbled inside, his denim jacket soaked through and clinging to his frame like a second heavy skin. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Dark, bruised hollows hung under his eyes, and his hands were vibrating with a fine, uncontrollable tremor. I guided him to the kitchen chair, the smell of stale coffee and wet fabric filling the small room. "You look like hell, son," I said, my voice low and level. "I haven't slept." "Dad," he replied, his voice cracking as he slumped forward. "Every time I close my eyes, I see my bank account hitting zero. It's like a countdown I can't stop." He didn't just suggest the investment. "Dad, she's already drafted the formal resignation letter for my current brokerage account. She told me she has the mobile transfer queued up on her phone. All she needs is my fingerprint to authorize the final push." The sheer clinical efficiency of the move made my skin prickle. You want to know the difference between a bad investment and a crime? A bad investment makes you feel stupid. A crime makes you feel like you're special. That's how they get the hooks in. Corbin reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of documents, spreading them across the table. They were glossy, high-end prospectuses for something called the Cascade Private Capital Fund. The paper was thick, embossed with gold foil that caught the dim kitchen light screaming of exclusivity and high-altitude returns. "She says it's a friends and family allocation," Corbin whispered, staring at the pages as if they might bite him. "She says I'm lucky to even get a seat at the table, that the intake window closes at the end of the month. In my experience, Corbin, the person telling you how lucky you are is usually the one holding the deck," I said, pulling the papers toward me. I felt the weight of his 401k, all $420,000 of his future hanging in the balance of these 17 pages. The paper felt too expensive. It felt like a funeral program for a rich man's future. My eyes scanned the fine print with a professional hunger I hadn't felt since I handed in my badge. I was looking for the cracks, the small inconsistencies that predators always leave behind. I flipped to the leadership page, my breath hitching in my throat. There, listed as the Director of Acquisitions, was a name that hit me like a physical blow. Marcus Holt. I stared at the name, a ghost from a cold case I couldn't solve 10 years ago. A man who had vanished after orchestrating a regional Ponzi scheme that ruined 50 families. I looked at the name and realized Briar wasn't just a con artist. She was working for a kingpin. I spread the 17 pages across my mahogany desk like a deck of cards, waiting for the one that would reveal Briar's hand. The clinical chill of my study, smelling of old paper, and the deep, sweet scent of polished wood usually offered me a sanctuary for thought. Today, it felt like a tactical operations center. Behind the closed door, I could hear the rhythmic, nervous pacing of Corbin in the kitchen, his boots heavy on the linoleum. My son was waiting for a lifeline. But as I adjusted my jeweler's loop, I suspected I was about to find a noose instead. The document was a masterpiece of misdirection. I started with the legal boilerplate, my eyes scanning for the microscopic inconsistencies in font and spacing that scream of a home office fabrication. Nice font. Breyer, I muttered to the empty room. Too bad the registration number belongs to a dissolved shell company. The deeper I dug, the uglier it became. Hidden within the dense thicket of legalese was a subscription agreement clause that made my pulse jump. It didn't just ask for an investment, it granted the fund total power of attorney over the investor's entire estate in the event of market volatility. It was a blank check for total financial annihilation. Do you know why scammers use fine print? Because they know the average person's eyes glaze over after the third, whereas in heretofore, they bet your boredom against your life savings. Most people see a mountain of paper and assume its weight equals legitimacy. I've spent 28 years knowing that the more paper someone gives you, the more they're trying to hide. I shifted my focus to the physical footprint of the Cascade Private Capital Fund. They claimed a prestigious headquarters on West Georgia Street in Seattle. I logged into a private investigator's database I'd kept active since retirement, cross-referencing the suite number. My lip curled in cold satisfaction. The address was a Level 1 mail forwarding service, a $40 a month digital mailbox sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a defunct travel agency. No multi-million-dollar fund operates out of a strip mall mailbox. I looked at the 18 to 22% returns highlighted in bold. They weren't just optimistic, they were statistically impossible signatures of a classic Ponzi scheme, the same kind Marcus Holt had used to bleed families dry a decade ago. My hands were steady, but the air in the room felt heavy like the atmosphere before a Pacific Northwest thunderstorm. I knew the hunter's trail when I saw it, and the scent here was foul. As I reached the final page, a specific detail stopped my heart. The document had been customized with a list of collateral assets. It didn't just mention Corbin's accounts. It listed the specific appraised value of my own home and the inventory of my private coin collection details Corbin had never mentioned to Breyer. Details he barely knew the specifics of himself. She hadn't just been raiding Corbin's heart. She'd been inventorying my life through the digital back door I'd found open last night. I turned to the signature line and saw it. Tucked into the bottom corner was a faint digital watermark of a stylized ghost. It didn't belong to any legitimate financial institution. It was a personal logo I'd only seen once before on a cold case file involving an international forgery ring that specialized in high-value identity theft. Breyer wasn't just working for Holt. She was the precision instrument of a global machine. I didn't pick up the desk phone. I pulled a burner from the false bottom of my humidor, the keypad light glowing like a predator's eye in the dim study. The smell of old tobacco and cedar clung to the plastic casing as I punched in a number I'd memorized years ago and never intended to use again. I waited, the sound of static on the line humming in my ear while I watched the rain lash against the window pane. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked, Corbin likely still vibrating with the shock of Marcus Holt's name. When the line finally clicked open, the voice on the other end was sharp, cautious, and unmistakably professional. "Thane? Michelle Torres?" asked, her tone shifting from formal to surprised. "You haven't called this line since the 2021 retirement party." Michelle Torres had been my best investigator for 6 years, a woman with the patience of a sniper and a mind that processed data like a supercomputer. I leaned back into the shadows of my chair, my voice dropping into that low, authoritative frequency. "I've got a dry run being repeated in my own living room. Michelle, I need the deep dive." I told her about the ghost watermark I'd found on the Cascade Fund documents. There was a pause, a heavy silence that lasted 3 beats too long. "That mark isn't just a signature. Thane," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "We've seen it in 3 active Pacific Northwest fraud cases this quarter. Our intel suggests it belongs to a forger currently suspected of working for the Canadian mob. not just some independent ring. The air in my study suddenly felt colder. In my world, a coincidence is just a piece of evidence that hasn't found its partner yet. This wasn't just about a greedy daughter-in-law. This was about an incursion. I provided the name and social security number I'd lifted from Corbin's tax returns. Briar Vein. Michelle's keyboard began to clatter, a rhythmic, frantic sound that I could hear clearly through the receiver. As she worked, my mind drifted back to the phantom fun case of 2018. We chased shadows for months while three families were systematically stripped of their homes and dignity. That was a dry run, too. A test of defenses before the real predators moved in for the kill. A clean record isn't a sign of innocence. Thane, Michelle muttered as the search results populated. It's a sign of a high-budget janitor. Briarvane's digital footprint is scrubbed so white it's blinding. No social media before 2015, no credit history before she moved to Portland. Check the aliases, I told her, my jaw tightening. Look for Sudbury or Mississauga connections. I knew the pattern. Then she went silent. That particular professional silence that meant she'd found the first hole in the lie. I could hear her breathing change, the rhythmic clicking of the mouse slowing down. Thane, look at this, she whispered. Briarvane's current Oregon driver's license was issued using a birth certificate that was reported stolen from a hospital fire in Ohio 10 years ago. She paused and I felt the hair on my arm stand up. The woman in your house isn't Briarvane. I just pulled the death certificate from the national database. The real Briarvane died in a car accident in 2014. My heart hammered against my ribs. A dull thudding warning. Stay away from her, Thane. You're living with a ghost. The ghost in my living room had a name, a 3-year marriage, and a daughter. But according to the state of Oregon, she was nothing more than a digital echo of a woman buried in a rain-soaked cemetery a decade ago. I stood by the window of my study watching the gray Portland rain streak against the glass. The news Michelle had delivered felt like a physical weight, a cold draft that had finally found its way under the door. I could hear Corbin's muffled voice from the kitchen, probably talking to himself or nursing that cold cup of coffee, completely unaware that the woman he loved was a phantom. Michelle's voice crackled through the burner phone detailing the real Briarvane's 2014 car accident in Sudbury. It had been a messy affair, a late-night slide off a bridge that the local authorities never quite put to rest. If Briar is a ghost, then who is the woman holding my granddaughter? I asked, my voice a jagged whisper. She's a ghostwriter. Thane, Michelle replied, the sound of digital rustling following her words. Someone who rewrites lives for a living. This isn't just identity theft. It's a total immersion. The nausea I felt was visceral, a slow churning in my gut as I realized that every intimate moment, every shared plan, and every memory my son possessed was built on a foundation of skeletal remains and professional forgery. My mind flickered to the entry twist. The Sudbury crash report had holes large enough to drive a truck through. There were no witnesses, and the body had been burned beyond easy recognition. It occurred to me with a surge of professional coldness that the imposter didn't just steal a name. She might have cleared the path for the theft herself. How do you tell a man that the woman who sleeps beside him every night is a shadow wearing the skin of a dead girl? I watched dust motes dancing in the singular shaft of light piercing the dim study, feeling the isolation of the truth. Michelle shifted gears, her tone sharpening as she pulled up the Eugene Martinez file. Eugene was a 71-year-old decorated veteran, a man of discipline and habit who had been systematically groomed by a boutique wealth management firm where the imposter once worked. She had been his light, his emotional support after his wife passed, and then with surgical precision, she had presented the limited window for a life-changing investment. Eugene didn't lose his $95,000 to a bad market. Michelle said, he lost it to a consultant who remembered his birthday. It's a grooming cycle. Thane, she doesn't ask for the money until she's the only person the victim trusts. My protective fury began to refine itself into analytical clarity. Pattern recognition is a blessing until it starts showing you the shape of your own family's executioner. I could smell the stale coffee on my desk, a bitter reminder of the long night behind me. Then came the second twist. Michelle went silent for a moment, the sound of her rhythmic typing the only thing filling the space between us. I found a secondary contact in the Martinez file, she said, her voice dropping. A lawyer named Marcus Holt who facilitated the final wire transfer. The name hit me like a second bullet. The ring was a machine, and Breyer was just the most visible gear. Michelle let out a sharp breath on the other end. Thane, I just pulled the witness statements from the Martinez case. Eugene isn't the only one she hit. There's a list of sons of wealthy retirees that the firm was tracking, and Corbin was next on the board. The revelation that my son was merely the next name on a predator's checklist left me in a state of clinical fury. I watched the digital clock on my desk flip to 6 p.m., the red numbers bleeding into the mahogany like a countdown I couldn't stop. I needed more than just a detective's instinct now. I needed a forensic verdict. I reached out to Stephen Gallagher, who had spent 20 years as a forensic accountant for the Crown, a man who could find a missing penny in a mountain of corporate trash. He had been reviewing the encrypted files I sent over an hour ago, and the tone of his voice when he answered told me the news was as grim as I'd feared. Thane, this isn't an investment document. It's a suicide note for a bank account, Stephen said, his voice crackling through the line. He explained that the Cascade Fund was a masterclass in what he called empty language. The subscription agreement was a frame without a painting. While it looked dense and official, the schedule for physical assets was intentionally blank, allowing the money to sit in a legal limbo. Even more insidious, he revealed that this Cascade Fund was a mirror of a legitimate high-performing fund in the Midwest. A savvy investor would search the name and see glowing reports, never realizing the routing number on their contract led to a digital black hole. How long do we have, Stephen? I asked, my hand tightening on the cold phone receiver. Give it to me in hours, not days. 72 hours, he replied. That's all it takes to turn a man's life's work into a string of zeros in a Cayman Islands server. He called it the laundry cycle. Once a wire transfer hits the primary intake, in this case, a BC credit union, the money has a half-life of 3 days. They split it, layer it through multiple shell companies, and then it simply evaporates. With the month-end deadline looming, I realized we weren't just in a race. We were in the final 48 hours of Breyer's grooming phase. She wasn't just moving money. She was erasing it. Believe me when I say that the most dangerous weapon in a thief's arsenal isn't a gun. It's a wire transfer confirmation. It's silent. It's instantaneous. And it's absolute. I felt the smell of old mahogany in my study turn oppressive, the weight of the silence outside my door pressing in. My analytical mind was already calculating the logistics of a freeze. But Stephen's next words stopped me cold. He had traced the email metadata from the prospectus Corbin had given me. Thane, this document wasn't sent from a corporate office, he said. It was sent from an IP address inside your own house at 3:15 a.m. yesterday. I felt a surge of ice water in my veins. Breyer had been sitting in my guest room using my own Wi-Fi to send the instruments of my son's destruction while I slept 20 feet away. The betrayal was no longer just financial. It was territorial. The hunter was inside the camp using my own fire to sharpen her knives. The study door creaked open, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. I looked up to see Corbin standing there, his face as white as a sheet, the sight of his dilated pupils telling me the grooming had reached its breaking point. Dad, he whispered, his voice trembling so hard it barely carried across the room. Breyer just asked for my login. She says the window is closing tonight. She says if I don't move it now, we lose everything. The sound of my chair scraping against the hardwood floor was the only warning I gave before I stood up to catch my son. Corbin looked like he was about to fold into himself, his knees buckling under the weight of the demand Breyer had just leveled at him. I didn't wait for him to process the fear. I grabbed my jacket and forced him toward the front door. We were in my car and moving toward his apartment within minutes, my hands gripping the wheel with precision of a patrolman heading toward a 1033 officer in need of assistance. The gray Portland morning blurred past us, but my mind was already inside his four walls scanning for the trap. When we entered his living room, the smell of stale air and unwashed laundry hit me like a physical blow. My eyes immediately began to sweep the perimeter looking for the telltale glint of a camera lens or the subtle disruption of a recording device. Breyer had been busy. The space had been subtly rearranged into a theater of productive anxiety. Stacks of glossy fake financial magazines were fanned out on the coffee table, and an opportunity board stood in the corner covered in charts and upward-sloping lines. I forced Corbin to sit on the sofa, making him put his phone face down as it vibrated incessantly with incoming texts. "Put the phone down." "Corbin," I commanded, my voice dropping into the flat, authoritative tone of a lead investigator. "You are not an architect right now. You are a witness." He looked at me, his hands shaking so hard he had to tuck them under his thighs. "She says if I don't do it now, we lose everything." He whispered. "The house, the school fund for Rhea, everything." I knelt in front of him, forcing him to meet my eyes. It wasn't just the money, and I knew it. There was a deeper hook. I watched him crumble as he finally admitted the truth. Breyer hadn't just found the records of his hit-and-run DUI from his lost years. She had actively harvested them. Shame is a predatory animal. It waits until you're tired. Then it bites into the softest part of your history and doesn't let go. She told him that if he didn't sign over the funds, she would anonymously leak the dashcam footage to his firm and the Child Services Board. It would be the end of his career in his custody of Rhea. I felt a cold, jagged fury rising in my throat as I realized she had even paid Marcus Holt to track down the original arresting officer and bribe him for the unedited footage. She didn't find those records. "Corbin," I said, my voice like iron. "She manufactured a cage for you. She fed your shame to keep you on a short leash. The woman he loved hadn't just built a life with him. She had built a prison with glass walls." Corbin looked at the wall clock, the rhythmic ticking sounding like a hammer on a nail. "He'll be here at noon." "Dad," he said, his voice a hollow reed. "Breyer scheduled a notary to come by and finalize the liquidation papers. She told me he's a close family friend who handles all her sensitive legal work." She called him Marcus. My blood turned to ice as I realized the kingpin wasn't just pulling strings from the shadows anymore. He was coming to the front door. The realization that Marcus Holt was walking toward my son's front door turned the drive home into a blur of cold, focused adrenaline. If they were hitting Corbin this hard, applying pressure to every fracture in his history, then my own house was likely already compromised. I returned home late Tuesday night, the Portland rain slicking the driveway into a dark mirror. I had left Corbin under Alora's watchful eye at a secure location, a friend's cabin where the perimeter was clear and the phone lines were dead. Stepping into my own study, the air felt heavy as if the room itself was holding its breath. While I reached for the hidden keypad behind the first edition Hemingway, the smell of gun oil and old books usually brought me a sense of order. But tonight it felt like the scent of a tomb. I punched in the code, the safe's electronic beep sounding like a gunshot in the midnight silence. I opened the floor safe, initially relieved to see my collection of gold eagles and Morgan silver dollars seemingly intact. I began a methodical inspection driven by the professional paranoia that Breyer's access to this house was never just about babysitting Rhea or playing the part of the doting daughter-in-law. I pulled out a 1907 St. Gaudens double eagle, the crown jewel of my retirement hedge, and felt a sudden sickening lightness in my palm. My stomach dropped. I checked the digital log on the safe's interior panel, and my blood turned to ice. The safe had been accessed 3 months ago using Alora's biometric bypass. It was impossible. Alora never came in here alone, and she certainly never touched the coins. I realized with a jolt of horror that Breyer must have recorded Alora's fingerprint while she was sleeping, or perhaps lightly drugged during one of those spa nights Breyer was always arranging. A man's home is his castle until he realizes the queen has been selling the bricks from the inside out. My sanctuary had been turned into a showroom for a thief who didn't even need a crowbar. I moved to my workbench, clicking on the overhead lamp. I used a precision scale and a digital caliper to test the St. Gaudens, the digital scale's high-pitched tinkle echoing off the mahogany walls. The weight was off by exactly 0.4 grams. I adjusted my jeweler's loop, my eyes stinging as I searched the rim of the coin. There they were, the microscopic tooling marks, the same ghost signature I had found on the Cascade Fund documents. It was a high-lead core Chinese counterfeit, a perfect visual replica that held absolutely no value. I went through the rest of the tray, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure clinical rage. Over 40% of my collection had been systematically swapped for worthless metal slugs. Metal. It's just painted lead, I whispered to the empty room. She's been walking through my house and stealing my past while I was making her tea. How many times had I sat in this very chair bragging to her about the rarity of a coin that was already sitting in her purse? My hands were trembling as I reached for the felt-lined case of a fake Morgan dollar. As I tilted the case, a small black object tumbled out. It was a GPS tracker, no larger than a button hidden inside the hollowed-out center of the counterfeit case. I stared at the tracker's blinking red light and realized Breyer wasn't just a thief. She was a jailer, and I had just walked right back into the center of her web. The phone in my pocket buzzed, the vibration feeling like an electric shock against my leg. But I didn't answer it. My eyes were fixed on the tracker's blinking red light, a silent confirmation that the woman my son loved had turned our lives into a controlled experiment. I spent the rest of the night in a state of icy clinical rage, calculating every move she had made while I was playing the part of the doting grandfather. By Wednesday morning, the rain had settled into a gray, insistent drizzle. I stood in the bank's sterile lobby watching my son's hands shake as he handed his ID to the teller, a man about to realize that the vault protecting his family's history had been hollowed out from the inside. Corbin moved with the lethargy of a man who had already accepted the worst, but the reality was far more surgical than he imagined. We were led back to a windowless viewing room that smelled of ozone and old paper. The heavy vault door swinging shut behind us with a finality that made the air feel thin. When the teller pulled the long metal deposit box, I saw Corbin's shoulder drop. He didn't even have to open it. He knew by the way the metal slid across the table it was too light. Inside there were no emeralds, no graduation Omega watch, and no heirloom gold. There was only a single folded receipt for a jewelry cleaning service that didn't exist. "It's gone," Corbin whispered, his voice echoing in the small, sterile room. "Dad, she told me she put it in here for safekeeping after the move." I felt the cold metal of the table under my palms. "Check the access logs, Corbin," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "Every time a shadow moves, it leaves a signature." We were moved to the bank manager's office where the rhythmic typing of the keyboard felt like a countdown. The manager revealed that Breyer had accessed the box 8 months ago, signing as Breyer Vane Garrison. But that wasn't the end of it. The manager looked at us with a pained expression, revealing that she had used the jewelry as collateral for a high-interest bridge loan in Corbin's name, a loan that was now 3 months overdue. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone you loved and realized they were just a mirror reflecting the person they wanted you to be while they picked your pockets? Corbin sat there, a hollowed-out version of the man I had raised. He began a mental inventory of their apartment, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The golf clubs he thought he'd left at the club, the vinyl collection he thought was in storage, even his backup laptop. They weren't lost. They were liquidated. He recalled Breyer's comforting voice, the way she'd sigh and tell him he was getting forgetful because he was too stressed at work. That's the hallmark of a professional son. I said, my heart breaking for him. They don't just steal your things. They steal your confidence so you won't look for them. The ink on the final document the manager handed us was blue, simple, and final. It was a pawn slip Corbin found tucked in the corner of the empty box for his grandmother's wedding ring. It was dated the very morning of their first wedding anniversary. Corbin dropped the slip, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. "She didn't just take the money. Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "She took my mother's memory and sold it for $40 a month." The drive from the bank to the state police HQ was the longest 10 miles of my life. The silence in the car vibrating with Corbin's raw, wounded fury. I didn't use the visitor's entrance. I swiped my retired officer's badge at the side gate, the heavy magnetic lock clicking open like the jaws of a trap finally being set. The smell of institutional floor wax hit me as we moved through the corridors, a scent that usually meant order, but today smelled like a crime scene stretching back years. Michelle Torres was waiting in a secure briefing room, her face lit by the cold blue glow of a digital map displaying a multi-state fraud ring. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They don't want the 401 key. Corbin," she said, her voice dropping as she pulled up a series of decrypted emails. "That's just the appetizer. They're after the main course." The map showed 12 families targeted across 5 states, all following the same predatory cycle. Then, she dropped the first hammer. Breyer had already applied for a life insurance policy on Corbin, including a double indemnity clause for accidental death. My son's face went pasty, his eyes fixed on the screen as the implication of a permanent exit strategy settled into the room. "Look at the timestamp on this email," Michelle continued, pointing to a message from Marcus Holt. "She was planning your chance meeting at the gym 6 months before it actually happened. How many accidental tragedies are actually just the final line of a well-written script?" I felt the cold laminate of the briefing table under my palms as I read the specific directives Breyer had received. This wasn't just about Corbin's savings. It was a long-game infiltration. The goal was my probate information, my private security codes, and the total liquidation of the Garrison estate, all 2.8 million of it. Every family holiday, every Sunday roast, every single time I let her hold my granddaughter while I made tea was nothing more than a reconnaissance mission. She wasn't just marrying into this family. She was being deployed into it to map my safe and my digital footprint. The gym membership, the random coffee spill, the wedding vows, all of it was a ledger entry. I felt a deep structural betrayal that went beyond money. It was the violation of my sanctuary, the weaponization of my son's need for love against the very person he should have been able to trust most. Pattern recognition is a cop's greatest tool, but seeing it applied to my own family felt like a slow-motion execution. Michelle tapped a final key, bringing up a grainy surveillance photo from a park. It showed Breyer meeting with a man whose face made my pulse hammer against my ribs. It was the same officer who had arrested Corbin for his DUI years ago. The realization hit me with a sickening thud. The arrest hadn't been a piece of bad luck. She discovered it was a staged event to create the shame they needed to control him. My hands gripped the edge of the table so hard the wood groaned in the quiet room. She didn't just find his past. "Michelle," I whispered, my voice thick with a lethal clinical rage. She manufactured his downfall to make herself the only person he could trust. We weren't looking at a wife anymore. We were looking at a saboteur who had been living in our guest room. The walk back to the parking lot from the state police headquarters felt like walking through a minefield that I finally had the map for. Every shadow in the concrete garage seemed to harbor a hidden agenda, and the icy, focused adrenaline in my veins made the steering wheel feel like a cold, skeletal extension of my own arms. Most people think of history as something that happens to you, but as I sat in the blue glare of my monitor back in the study, I realized my son's life had been a script written by a stranger 3 years before they ever met. The hum of the computer cooling fan was the only sound in the room save for the rhythmic clicking of my mouse as I waded through the encrypted data dump Stephen Gallagher had just sent. It was a digital autopsy of Breyer's history. Stephen had managed to recover search logs from a laptop she'd attempted to scrub clean back in 2021. I scrolled past the mundane until my breath hitched. My own name appeared. Thane Garrison, then Oregon State Police retirement date, then estimated pension value. She'd searched my net worth and the actuarial tables for my lifespan months before she ever introduced herself to Corbin. My son wasn't the target. He was the weakest entry point into the estate I'd spent 30 years building. My gut twisted with a clinical horror. There was even a secondary target list specifically naming my wife Alara. Breyer had been mapping out ways to create a rift between us, preparing to isolate me if the angle with Corbin failed to yield the keys to the vault. She didn't fall for his smile. "Stephen," I muttered to the empty room, the smell of stale coffee lingering like a bad memory. She fell for my actuarial tables. How do you tell a man that the most beautiful coincidence of his life was actually a trap set by a woman who had already spent 100 hours studying his morning coffee routine? The data showed she joined Corbin's gym exactly 2 weeks before their meet cute at the juice bar. She had set Google alerts for his social media check-ins and used a fitness app to track his jogging routes until she knew his pace better than he did. The random spill of her protein shake that started their first conversation wasn't a clumsy accident. It was a timed, tactical insertion, as calculated as a SWAT team breach. 4 months of stalking just to say hello. That's not romance. It's a siege. The date on the search query was October 14th, 11 months before the wedding. The hunt started before the prey even knew the season was open. I felt my paternal fury sharpening into a lethal protective focus. My touch on the cold desk surface was steady, but my mind was screaming at the violation. I reached a folder of images recovered from a deleted cloud drive and felt the hair on my neck stand up. One photo showed Breyer standing on the sidewalk outside my house a full year before she married my son. She was holding a floor plan of the neighborhood, her eyes fixed on my front door with the hunger of a wolf. I zoomed in on the photo, my heart hammering against my ribs. She wasn't alone. She was holding the hand of a man whose face was blurred by motion, but whose signet ring I recognized instantly. It was the same unique heavy gold band I'd seen on Marcus Holt during a brief tense deposition a decade ago. The ghost wasn't just in the machine, he was standing on my curb. The walk from my study to the kitchen felt like moving through a house that was no longer mine, but a crime scene I hadn't finished processing. I sat in the parking lot across from the coffee shop, the headset in my ear crackling with the ambient noise of a crowded cafe and the heavy rhythmic thumping of my son's heart. Through the window of Stumptown Coffee, I watched Corbin approach the corner table where Breyer sat, her posture as poised and predatory as a hawk. The smell of roasted beans and wet raincoats seemed to drift through the receiver. Or perhaps my mind was simply filling in the gaps of the institutional gray afternoon. Corbin took a seat, his phone recording every vibration from his front shirt pocket. I listened as he began his performance, his voice pitched in that specific, submissive tone of an apologetic husband. "I'm sorry for the hesitation, Breyer Ben," he said, and I could hear his shallow, controlled breathing. "I just wanted to make sure we were doing what's best for Rhea." Breyer didn't miss a beat. Her manicured nails tapped the table with a sharp, rhythmic click that sounded like a ticking clock. "It's okay, honey," she replied, her voice smooth as silk. High net worth moves like this are always a bit scary the first time. Sensing the imminent payday, she dropped her guard, detailing the Cascade private capital structure with a terrifying, predatory grace. She leaned in closer, whispering that the notary who would sign the final documents was a close family friend named Marcus. The name sent a jolt of ice through my chest. It confirmed the ring's local presence and the absolute lack of independent oversight. Hearing her voice through the receiver was like listening to a siren, beautiful, melodic, and designed to lead a man straight onto the rocks. She was good. She was the kind of professional who could sell a drowning man a lead vest and make him thank her for the wait. Breyer then provided the exact wire transfer details for a credit union in British Columbia. Her voice steady as she explained they avoided big banks for processing speed. She confirmed the 18 to 22% annual returns on audio, explicitly telling Corbin that the intake window would slam shut in less than 24 hours. I noted every admission, every fraudulent solicitation, and every unregistered security claim as if I were back on active duty building a case for a prosecutor I hadn't met yet. "The money will be working for us within 72 hours of the transfer hitting this account," she promised. 72 hours. Corbin repeated, and I could hear the grit in his voice. "And then it grows 3 times faster than a standard 401k. How many times had she sat across from a victim and watched the hope in their eyes while she planned their bankruptcy? As Corbin stood to leave, Breyer's voice took on a playful, chilling edge. She mentioned she'd already packed a bag for a surprise celebration trip to Vancouver. The satisfaction of the trap being set was instantly replaced by a cold, hard urgency. She wasn't just planning a vacation. She was ready to flee the moment the wire cleared. Corbin walked out into the rain, his face deathly still. As he passed my car without a glance, he reached the sidewalk and whispered into the hidden mic, The sound of an espresso machine hissing in the background of the recording finally cutting out. She's ready. Dad, she's already got the passports in her purse. The drive back to my house was a hollow exercise in forced composure. Beside me, the recording in Corbin's pocket felt like a live wire humming with the predatory details of Breyer's exit plan. I didn't say much. I couldn't. My mind was already racing past the wire transfer toward a darker possibility that had been flickering in the periphery of my professional intuition for weeks. There is a specific kind of cold that starts in a detective's gut when he realizes the family tree he's been watering is actually made of plastic and lies. When we walked through the front door, the smell of lavender baby lotion greeted us, a scent that should have been comforting, but now felt like a floral shroud over a crime scene. Rhea, my 2-year-old granddaughter, was a bundle of curls and innocent laughter who had no idea she was the primary leverage in a multi-million-dollar war. She was playing on the rug with a set of wooden blocks, the sharp clattering sound echoing against the hardwood floors. I sat in my armchair and watched her with a clinical eye I usually reserve for witness statements. I recalled the emergency birth at a small hospital 3 hours away, a frantic night where Breyer had aggressively refused to provide the Garrison family's genetic history for the medical records, citing some vague privacy concern. Now I noted the discrepancies. Rhea lacked the Garrison height that had defined our men for 4 generations. Her eye color and earlobe structure traits I knew were dominant in our line were completely absent. "She's getting so tall, Breyer," I remarked, my voice steady despite the hammering in my chest. "She doesn't have that classic Garrison height, though." Breyer barely looked up from her phone, her manicured fingers flying across the screen. "Genetics are a roll of the dice. Thane, you know that." She stood up and reached into her diaper bag, and as she pulled out a rattle, I saw the edge of several documents. My heart stopped. They were Canadian travel consent forms already filled out and forged with Corbin's signature. How far would a predator go to ensure their leverage? Would they steal a child's bloodline just to keep the ransom high? I've seen men killed for a few $100s, for 2.8 million. A whole identity is just a item on a spreadsheet. When Breyer's phone rang and she stepped into the kitchen to take the call, I moved. My hands, which shouldn't have been shaking after 30 years on the force, reached for Rhea's discarded pacifier on the coffee table. The pacifier was still warm, a piece of plastic holding the truth of my son's entire existence. I used a sterile cloth from my study to bag it, the movement practiced and swift. I looked at Rhea, who was staring at me with wide, slightly glassy eyes. I realized then why she had been so lethargic lately. The faint herbal scent of a sedative clung to her breath. Breyer wasn't just planning to leave. She was ensuring the cargo remained quiet. I retreated to my study and locked the door. I logged into a secure lab portal I'd used during my private consulting years and initiated a 72-hour rush paternity comparison against the sample Corbin had provided during his last physical. I clicked confirm on the lab request, my heart hammering against my ribs as I looked at the countdown timer. 72 hours until I found out if my granddaughter was even a Garrison at all. The 72 hours felt like a lifetime, each second ticking by with the weight of a gavel striking the surface of my soul. I sat in my study, the smell of old paper and stale anxiety hanging in the air like a fog I couldn't navigate. My eyes were fixed on the monitor, my hands cold as I watched the refresh icon spin on my laptop screen, a small silver circle that held the power to delete 2 years of my son's life with a single percentage point. When the encrypted file finally bloomed into clarity, the world seemed to stop spinning. The lab results were stark, clinical, and absolute. A 0% probability of paternity. Corbin was not Rhea's father. I felt a sickening weight settle in my chest. The kind of heavy, airless pressure I'd only felt at the most grisly crime scenes. 0. It was a clean break. A total fabrication. She didn't just steal his money. She stole his bloodline. As I dug deeper into the technical breakdown of the alleles, a darker suspicion began to take shape. I cross-referenced the markers with the data Michelle had provided on the ring's known associates. My pulse hammered as I found a partial match between Rhea and the forger's lineage. It was a factory setting. The ring wasn't just stealing lives. They were literally breeding the leverage they needed to hollow out men like my son. A paternity test doesn't measure love. It just measures the distance between two people's cells. But in a court of law, that distance is an ocean. I heard the ticking clock on the mantel sounding like a countdown to an execution. I called Corbin into the study. He walked in with a hopeful, questioning look that I had to extinguish with a single glance. I showed him the monitor. He didn't scream or rage. He simply collapsed into the cold leather chair, his ragged breathing the only sound in the room. The silence was heavy with the sound of a man's heart breaking into jagged pieces. "She's not mine, Dad," he whispered, his eyes red and unfocused. All this time, I was just a placeholder. I watched him struggle with the existential gravity of the lie. The realization that every midnight feeding and every first step had been part of a long game performance. If a man builds a house on a foundation of sand, but fills it with a lifetime of warmth, is the home any less real when the tide comes in? Corbin answered that question himself. He looked up, his face hardening into a fierce, defiant mask I hadn't seen since he was a boy defending a friend on the playground. "It doesn't change a thing," he said, his voice regaining its steel. "I'm the one who held her when she had the fever. I'm her father. Period." He then revealed a detail that made my professional blood run cold. Breyer had claimed a medical emergency shortly after the birth that prevented any further children. It was a move to ensure Rhea remained the sole undisputed heir to my estate. The premeditation was a suffocating shroud. Corbin stood up, wiping his eyes with a shaking hand, his resolve as sharp as a razor. "If she thinks she can use a lab report to take my daughter to Canada, she's forgotten whose son I am." The drive to the federal building was the longest silence we'd ever shared, the DNA report sitting between us on the console like an unexploded bomb. I watched my son out of the corner of my eye, seeing the way he gripped the door handle until his knuckles were ivory white. He didn't look shattered anymore. He looked forged. The steel doors of the federal building closed behind us with a pneumatic hiss that sounded exactly like a prison gate. Only this time, I was the one making sure the right person ended up on the inside. We were led deep into the interior through corridors that smelled of institutional coffee and nerves until we reached a secure war room. Michelle Torres was already there standing beside Agent Vance. Agent Vance was a tall, lean man with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many life savings vanish into thin air, and he looked at my son like a piece of evidence he couldn't afford to break. The room was dominated by digital maps on the wall, glowing with the heat signatures of a multi-state investigation. "We've been chasing this cell for 18 months, Vance said, his voice as dry as parchment. "Your son just handed us the keys to their kingdom." He played the audio recording from Stumptown Coffee, the sound of audio feedback making me wince, but the words were clear enough to hang a dozen men. Breyer's voice detailing the wire fraud was the smoking gun they needed. However, Vance's expression remained grim. He revealed that while they had flagged Breyer's passport at the Canadian border, they were legally hamstrung until she either attempted to cross or signed the final fraudulent documents scheduled for the morning. How do you breathe normally when you know the woman sleeping 3 feet away is a viper waiting for the sun to rise? That was the question hanging in the air as Vance outlined the tactical plan. It was a 3-pronged raid scheduled for 8 a.m. Friday. Corbin's apartment, Marcus Holt's legal office in Seattle, and the residence of their primary forger. "Corbin, you have to go back," Vance said, leaning over the cold metal table. "You have to be the man she thinks she's already broken. One more night of normal." I felt a surge of protective fury, but I knew the man was right. In a tactical operation, the silence is never empty. It's filled with the variables you haven't accounted for yet. If she smells the FBI, she won't go to the bank. She'll go for the border, and she'll take the girl with her. The pressure of the 72-hour window was crushing now, a physical weight on my shoulders. Then Michelle tapped a key and a new flight manifest appeared on the screen. She unmasked a private charter flight booked for 11 a.m. Friday from a small private airfield. It was paid for in cash by a Diana Voss. That's her, I whispered. She's not waiting for the bank transfer to clear. She's leaving as soon as the signature is on the paper. The arrest window wasn't just tight. It was a needle's eye. Vance looked Corbin dead in the eye, his voice dropping to a low lethal register. If she takes that child and reaches that airfield before we breach, she's gone. You cannot fail tonight. The walk back to the parking garage felt like stepping into the cold air before a dive. I had spent my career learning that the most dangerous moment isn't when you're in the dark. It's when you finally think you've seen everything and you let your guard down for one heartbeat. By the time I arrived home at 6 o'clock, a deceptive sense of control had settled over me. I retreated to my study, the blue light of the monitor illuminating the final investigative logs I was syncing with the FBI's cloud server. My hands were steady, my mind already cataloging the victory. Elara and I shared a tense dinner, the clinking of silverware against china, the only rhythm to our hushed conversation about the psychological parent doctrine we would need to secure Ria's future. Tomorrow morning, Elara, I said, leaning back with a sigh that felt far too much like relief. By 8:05, this is over. Vance is ready. The trap is set. Elara looked at me, her eyes clouded with a wisdom I should have heeded. Don't underestimate her, Thane. A cornered animal doesn't just run, it bites. I brushed it off, confident in the digital trail I had helped blaze. I didn't notice the static on my burner phone until it was too late. As I reviewed the logs, I saw an entry twist I hadn't prepared for a series of doctored text messages originating from my own encrypted line messages that painted a picture of a man unhinged, threatening violence against my daughter-in-law. She hadn't just been watching. She had cloned my burner. The paper felt heavier than a lead coin. It was a court-ordered blindfold. The chime of the doorbell at 6:30 didn't sound like a delivery. It sounded like a funeral bell. I opened the door to find a process server, a weary-looking man in a wrinkled polo shirt, a low-level cog in a legal machine that Breyer had just hijacked. He didn't look me in the eye as he thrust a stack of cold, crisp legal papers into my hand. You've been served, Mr. Garrison, he muttered. You need to step back from the door. I looked down at the temporary restraining order. The words harassment, erratic behavior, and threats of violence jumping off the page in stark black ink. It was an absolute prohibition 500 feet from Breyer and Ria, and zero contact with Corbin. She's isolating them, I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. This isn't a legal move. It's a tactical wall. How do you protect your family when the law itself has been turned into a weapon for the thief? I felt Ilaria's presence behind me, her face draining of color as she read the top page. The car engine of the process server idled in the rain-dampened driveway, the smell of exhaust and wet pavement filling my lungs. I flipped to the witness statement at the back, expecting a fabrication from a stranger. Instead, I found a betrayal that reached into the marrow of my bones. The statement confirming my unstable history was signed by a familiar name. I looked at the signature on the witness statement and felt my stomach drop. It wasn't just a former cop. It was my own brother Vernon who had been groomed and used to bury me. The conspiracy hadn't just reached the precinct. It had reached my dinner table years ago, and now the gate was locked from the outside. The darkness of Friday morning at 6 a.m. felt like a shroud, and my phone was a dead weight I wasn't allowed to touch. That legal paper in my study, signed by my own brother, had effectively severed my connection to the people I needed to protect most. I sat in the silence of my kitchen, a prisoner of a temporary restraining order, while across town the trap Breyer had built was snapping shut. I could almost hear the gears grinding. The sun hadn't even cleared the Cascades when Breyer dropped a manila envelope onto the breakfast table in Corbin's apartment, not with the gentleness of a wife, but with the heavy, final thud of a guillotine blade. Corbin told me later that the sound seemed to echo through the entire flat. She didn't offer him coffee. She offered him an ultimatum. Inside that envelope was a copy of the DNA results I had spent 72 hours sweating over. She'd intercepted them. Or perhaps she'd had a duplicate set all along. "You're not her father. Corbin," she said, her voice a flat line. "You're just a roommate who's been paying the bills." She laid out the final wire transfer authorization for the $420,000, her triumphant smile glinting in the dim light of the kitchen. If he didn't sign it by noon, she was filing for emergency sole custody using the DNA to prove he had no rights before vanishing to Canada. She'd already filed a petition using Clear's throat, the doctored evidence she'd used against me, painting the whole Garrison family as a nest of dangerous lunatics. How do you look into the eyes of the woman who shared your bed and see only the cold, calculating hunger of a wolf? My son sat there feeling the walls of his life closing in. But he remembered my training. He fought back the urge to scream, to reach across the table and demand his life back. Instead, he forced his breathing to slow. He played the part of the broken, defeated man she expected him to be. "Fine," he told her, his voice trembling with a well-earned desperation. "You win. Just don't take her. I'll sign it. But I have to do it at the bank branch at 9 o'clock to make sure the flags don't trigger an automatic freeze." The coffee in his mug was cold. The air in the room was colder. Breyer leaned back, watching him with the satisfaction of a predator that had finally worn its prey down. "Good boy," she purred. "I knew you'd see reason when the stakes were high enough." Corbin's stalling bought the FBI 2 critical hours, a thin margin of safety in a game that was rapidly running out of time. While she was distracted by her victory, he managed to trigger the SOS signal we'd set up on the smart thermostat, a simple temperature spike that would alert the task force. But as he stood up to clear the table, he saw it. A small, flesh-colored bud in her ear glinting as the morning light caught the plastic. She wasn't just acting on her own. She was being coached in real time. Marcus Holt was in her ear, directing the kill from a nearby vantage point. Breyer tapped her earpiece and smiled a look of pure triumph that made Corbin's skin crawl. "Marcus says the notary is 10 minutes away," she said. "We don't need the bank. Corbin, we're doing this here." I watched the grain of the video feed from the smart doorbell vibrate as heavy, silent boots moved into the stairwell. The federal hammer was finally in the air, and Breyer had no idea the ceiling was about to collapse. I was legally barred from being within 500 feet of that apartment. But Michelle had opened a digital window for me, a secure link that let me monitor the silent swarm of tactical teams saturating the complex. On my monitor, heat signatures moved like ghosts through the rain-drenched shadows of the hallway. Inside the apartment, Corbin was a statue of forced calm, distractedly bouncing Rhea on his knee while a cartoon jingle played with mocking cheerfulness in the background. Breyer paced the length of the living room like a hungry cat, her manicured fingers twitching every time she glanced at the window. "He's just pulling in now." "Corbin," she said, her voice tight with a predatory greed she could no longer hide. "Get the pen ready. I need to change her diaper first." Breyer Corbin countered, his voice steady even as 82 heartbeats per minute thudded against his chest. "Just give me a second." I saw the entry twist clearly on the high-definition perimeter. Cam, the notary arriving in the black sedan, wasn't a civil servant. He was a man built like a fire hydrant, wearing a suit 2 sizes too small, and carrying a briefcase that likely held more lead than paper. As he stepped out, the jacket pulled tight, revealing the unmistakable print of a concealed weapon. The celebration trip to Vancouver was never meant to have a return flight for my son. Before I show you what was actually inside that briefcase, are you still with me? Comment one word for what you're feeling right now, so I can see how you're reading this. Please note, what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes meant to convey the core message of vigilance. If this crosses your comfort line, you can leave now. The notary reached the threshold of the building. In my ear, Michelle's voice was a sharp, professional whisper. "Target is at the threshold. All units hold for the primary signature. Thane, if you're listening, we've got them." The tactical lead signaled breach minus 60 seconds. I adjusted the contrast on my screen, my hands gripping the control joystick until my knuckles were white. How many families had been destroyed by this exact sequence of events before we stepped into the line of fire? I felt a jolt of cold recognition as the camera panned to the street corner. There, parked 2 blocks away with its headlights off, was my brother Vernon's car. He wasn't just a witness. He was the getaway driver, the final piece of a betrayal that made my gorge rise. Tactical agents stacked up against the wall outside Corbin's door, their weapons at the ready, black-clad shadows against the beige apartment wallpaper. Breyer reached for the deadbolt, a triumphant smile lighting her face as she prepared to welcome the end of our family's history. "Come in," she called out, her voice melodic and deadly. "Let's get this over with." I held my breath, watching the lead agent's arm back. The notary's hand reached for the door handle just as the flashbang left the agent's hand. The world was about to turn white. The world didn't just turn white. It shattered into 1,000 jagged shards of sound and light as the front door disintegrated inward, the shockwave punching the air right out of my son's lungs. Through the grainy digital link Michelle provided, I watched the living room vanish behind a veil of dust and magnesium glare. Black-clad agents flooded the space with the terrifying efficiency of a midnight tide, their boots thundering against the floorboards I had helped Corbin polish just 6 months ago. Breyer was thrown to the carpet before she could even scream, her face pressed into the very rug she had once used to groom her prey. Corbin, acting on pure instinct, dived for Rhea. He shielded her small, trembling body with his own as the notary was tackled against the breakfast table, his briefcase flying open and spilling forged documents across the room like confetti from a funeral. "FBI, get down. Hands behind your head." The lead agent roared his voice, cutting through the ringing in my ears. I saw Corbin pull Rhea tight against his chest, whispering words I couldn't hear but could feel in my own marrow. "I've got you. I've got you, little bird." During the struggle, Breyer's earpiece fell out, skittering across the floor. In the silence that followed the breach, we all heard it. Marcus Holt's voice, a tinny, frantic scratching through the plastic bud, barking orders to kill the lights and run. He had been watching us through a hidden camera the entire time. The smell of cordite and lavender baby lotion is a combination that should never exist in the same room. As the heavy zip ties clicked shut around Breyer's wrists, her perfect wife persona evaporated instantly. She didn't cry. She snarled. Her face became a feral mask of rage, her voice a jagged blade as she screamed about the DNA results. "You're nothing," she shrieked, her eyes wild as they locked onto Corbin. "You're holding a stranger's kid. You pathetic loser. You have no rights." Corbin didn't even look at her. He stood up, his focus entirely on the child in his arms, ignoring the venom she tried to use as a curse. "She's my daughter, Breyer," he said, his voice a low, vibrating cord of steel. "She's the only real thing you ever touched. You want to know what true strength looks like? It's not the guys with the battering rams. It's the man who can walk through a war zone without letting go of a 2-year-old's hand." I watched him carry her past the agents into the hallway, my own vision blurring with tears I couldn't blink away. Paternal victory isn't always a celebration. Sometimes it's just a survivor reaching the shore. As Corbin secured Rhea in the hallway, he ran his hand over her favorite stuffed bear, feeling something hard sewn into the fabric of the paw. He ripped the seam open and found a tracking device small and cold, realizing then that Breyer intended to use the girl as a homing beacon even if they were separated. The betrayal was bottomless. Corbin stepped out into the morning air, his shirt stained with Breyer's spilled coffee and Rhea's tears, and he looked straight into the camera hidden on his lapel. "It's done, Dad," he whispered, his voice finally cracking. "But we just found the tracker in her bear. They're still coming for her." I didn't wait for the handcuffs to stop ringing in the Portland air. I was already on the secure line with Michelle, watching the digital dominoes start to topple across the Pacific Northwest. Reports flooded into the command center as the FBI hit secondary targets with the precision of a clockmaker. Marcus Holt had been apprehended in Seattle, literally 3 minutes from the runway of a private airfield, and Diana Voss was caught in a Vancouver hotel clutching a bag filled with 3 different passports and $50,000 in cash. It was a nationwide takedown, a house of cards finally meeting a hurricane. Michelle confirmed they had recovered a central ledger, a literal blueprint for misery detailing 12 other families being systematically hollowed out. They were planning to bleed you dry by Christmas, Thane. She said, her voice heavy with the scale of it. Combined losses would have exceeded $8 million. I realized then that Briar's marriage to Corbin was just one ugly gear in a massive predatory machine. It wasn't love. It was industrial-scale harvesting. But the victory felt hollow as I watched Corbin stare at a cold glass of water in a law office 3 hours later. You can catch the thief, but that doesn't mean you get the peace of mind back. Sometimes the trial is harder than the crime. We were sitting in the office of Sarah Brennan. Sarah Brennan was a woman who wore her reputation like a suit of armor, her eyes sharp enough to cut through any lie a witness could conjure. The smell of expensive leather and law books should have felt stable, but the air was electric with a new kind of dread. The FBI revealed an entry twist that made my skin crawl. Briar had already pre-signed Ria's adoption papers over to Marcus Holt in a different jurisdiction, creating a legal paradox intended to strip Corbin of any standing the moment she crossed the border. The law cares about blood. Sarah said, her voice a low melodic warning. But a good judge cares about the person who changes the diapers. We have to pivot to the psychological parent doctrine immediately. If we don't, the state or Holt's remaining associates could move Ria to a foster facility by nightfall. The law is a blunt instrument. We had to sharpen it into a scalpel before the other side used it as a hammer. Corbin's face was a mask of determined anxiety. They're going to use that 0% DNA test to claim I'm a stranger, he whispered, the sound of a printer humming in the background, sounding like a death march as Sarah flipped through the thick case file. Her hand stopped on a specific page. The betrayal found a new depth. She discovered that Briar's emergency custody petition, the one meant to bury us, had been notarized by my own brother Vernon 2 weeks prior. He hadn't just been a getaway driver. He had been the legal architect for our family's destruction. Sarah looked up from the file, her face draining of all professional neutrality. Thane, there's one more thing, she said, her eyes fixed on a social security number at the bottom of a medical release. Briar filed these papers under a different identity, one that belongs to a woman in Ohio who is still very much alive and has been looking for her kidnapped daughter for 18 months. The room went silent. The distant city sirens, the only sound left in a world that had just reinvented its own horror. The silence of the Multnomah County Courthouse on Monday morning was deafening, a heavy pressure that seemed to hum in the very marble of the walls. I adjusted the knot of Corbin's tie as we stood before the towering bronze doors of the courthouse, his hands steady for the first time in a week, while a sea of reporters waited like vultures for the fall of the Garrison name. The taste of bitter courthouse coffee lingered on my tongue, a reminder of the long hours spent with Sarah Brennan prepping for this moment. We weren't just here to fight a fraud. We were here to save a child from being swallowed by a legal void. I gripped the cold wooden railing as we navigated the gauntlet of the lobby, the sight of the bronze statue of Lady Justice feeling more like a threat than a promise. We were led into the private chambers of Judge Holloway. Judge Holloway was a woman with silver hair and eyes like polished granite, someone who had seen 1,000 broken homes and had no patience for anything but the absolute truth. Sarah didn't waste a second. She laid out the autopsy of Briar's identity, revealing the stolen Social Security number that belonged to a living woman in Florida. This isn't just about custody, Your Honor, Sarah said, her voice echoing in the small room. It's about a ghost trying to claim a living child. However, the air in the room shifted when the opposing counsel presented their own motion. From her jail cell, Briar had attempted to appoint Marcus Holt as Ria's legal guardian, claiming he was the biological father to circumvent Corbin's standing. It was a tactical strike intended to sever the Garrison line entirely. The courthouse air was thick with the smell of floor wax and old secrets, a place where families are either mended or dismantled by a single stroke of a pen. I watched Holloway's face, searching for a crack in the granite, but she remained unreadable. Mr. Garrison, the law is interested in facts, not your professional history as a detective, she said, her eyes shifting to Corbin. Sarah then invoked the psychological parent doctrine, the pivot we'd bet everything on. She argued that biology was secondary to the primary caregiving bond, detailing the 2 years Corbin spent as Ria's sole stable provider while Briar was busy manufacturing a multi-state heist. Biology didn't read her goodnight moon 400 times, Corbin said as he took the stand. I did. I am the only father she has ever known, and I am the only one she asks for when she's scared. Then Corbin looked the judge in the eye. He didn't look like my little boy anymore. He looked like a man who would burn the world down for his child. The room fell silent as a court-appointed advocate added that since her removal, Rhea had been calling for Dada incessantly, a detail that landed like a physical weight. But the victory was short-lived. Judge Holloway leaned forward, her expression unreadable, and her voice devoid of sentiment. Mr. Garrison, the law on biological rights is very clear. If Mr. Holt is the father, your psychological bond may not be enough to stop her from being handed to a stranger. I felt the floor drop out from under me as I realized the kingpin was still holding the high ground from behind bars. The sound of Sarah Brennan's briefcase clicking open was the last thing I heard before we retreated from the courthouse to find the ammunition we needed to survive it. DNA is just a sequence of proteins, but a fatherhood is built from 3,000 sleepless nights. And I was going to make sure the court felt every single one of them. We couldn't let Marcus Holt's biological claim stand as the final word. Back at the Garrison home, I transformed the dining room into a tactical command center. The smell of printer ink was thick in the air, a chemical sharp contrast to the stale, lukewarm coffee sitting on my desk. Thousands of time-stamped photos and videos were spread across the mahogany table like the fragments of a broken mirror we were trying to piece back together. Ilara sat at the laptop, the sound of her rhythmic typing a constant hum as she meticulously cross-referenced pediatric records and daycare logs. We found that Corbin had attended 100% of Rhea's medical appointments, while Breyer was allegedly traveling for business. Every fever, every first step, every nightmare. It was all Corbin, Ilara said, her voice trembling but determined. We aren't just proving he's a dad. Ilara, I replied, staring at a photo of my son holding a sleeping Rhea. We're proving she was never a mother. I uncovered an entry twist that made my blood run cold as I dug through Breyer's faked health logs. She had been systematically faking Rhea's allergies to peanuts and dairy for over a year, using them as a weapon to restrict Corbin's movements and keep him isolated from his own social circle. It was the ultimate leash. A mother's love is supposed to be a sanctuary. For Rhea, it was a ledger. By midnight, I managed to bypass the encryption on Breyer's secondary cloud drive. I sat in my study, my hands steady on the cold computer mouse as I read the archives. The clinical horror of it was staggering. In emails sent to Marcus Holt during the first year of Rhea's life, Breyer described the child as a necessary anchor in a long-term insurance policy for the Garrison estate. She called her a leverage unit. My granddaughter was a line item on a spreadsheet to these people. How do you explain to a 2-year-old that her very existence was an investment strategy? I felt a sickening realization wash over me, followed by a surge of righteous anger that cleared the fatigue from my mind. This goes to the judge. Tonight, I won't let them reduce a child's soul to a financial instrument. As I scrolled through the final documents, I found an email from Breyer to the forger that revealed the true depth of her depravity. She had actually spent months looking for a child to adopt through illegal human trafficking channels before deciding to use Marcus as a biological donor because it would look more authentic for the EO scam. She didn't want a daughter. She wanted a prop that shared the ringleader's genetic code. I found a folder labeled Project Exit and felt the hair on my neck stand up as the screen flickered in the dark room. Breyer hadn't just planned to take Rhea to Canada. She had planned to leave her there with Marcus and disappear entirely once the Garrison money was laundered. Rhea wasn't even the prize to her. She was just the bait. The meeting with the district attorney's office felt like walking into a storm that was finally blowing in our favor. I carried the weight of the Project Exit files in my mind, but in my hands, I carried the physical evidence of a monster. I stepped into the cold fluorescent office air, the smell of old file folders and institutional floor wax grounding me as I prepared for the final deep dive into the wreckage Breyer had created. I didn't sit down immediately. I slammed a stack of 4 different birth certificates onto the prosecutor's desk, each one bearing Marcus Holt's name and a different mother's signature. The paper trail of a man who treated fatherhood like a franchise opportunity. The district attorney was a sharp-featured woman who looked like she'd been carved out of Oregon flint, and she handled the stack of fraud reports like she was loading a shotgun. She looked from the certificates to the mugshot on her monitor, where Marcus Holt's smug smile seemed to mock the very concept of justice. My deep dive had yielded a sickening pattern. Holt had fathered 4 other children across Nevada, Arizona, and California, using each one as a biological anchor to claim custody of heirs to wealthy estates. Once the assets were liquidated, he vanished. I discovered that one of those leveraged children had actually been abandoned in a Canadian hospital after the scam collapsed. "He doesn't want a daughter, Michelle," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "He wants a key to my safe deposit box. He's a biological donor for hire for the ring, 4 kids in 5 years, and he's never paid a dime in support or attended a single school play." How do you define a monster? Is it the person who steals your money, or the one who sires a child just to use her as a crowbar? I watched the DA's face as she absorbed the affidavits I'd collected from the other mothers. The righteous indignation in the room was palpable. We then pivoted to the project exit files I'd recovered from Breyer's Drive. They explicitly detailed Marcus's fee for providing the biological leverage needed for the Garrison scam. The sound of a heavy stapler echoed through the office as the DA began attaching these exhibits to her motion. "We're moving to terminate his rights alongside Breyer's," she said, her eyes narrowing as she read the Arizona file. "He's not a father. He's a co-conspirator. Make sure the judge sees the Arizona file." I urged. "The similarities are chilling. The Arizona child was named Leo. He's 6 now. He still waits by the window for a man who only saw him as a decimal point." I felt a calculated satisfaction as the final nail was driven into the coffin of Marcus's attempt to spite-take Rhea. We were stripping away the legal shield of his biological rights by his intent was purely criminal. But then I noticed a detail I had missed in my haste. I realized that Marcus was planning a backup move, a lawsuit for grandparental alienation to secure a monthly settlement even if he lost custody. The greed was bottomless. The DA looked up from the Arizona file, her eyes narrowing as she pointed to a handwritten note in the margins. "Thane, there's a note here. Marcus wasn't just working for Breyer. He was working for someone else, someone who's been inside your police department." The morning of the final hearing felt like the air before a lightning strike, heavy with the scent of rain and old wood. The Multnomah County Courthouse was a fortress of polished granite, but inside it smelled of furniture polish and the quiet, desperate hope of people whose lives had been picked apart by the law. The gavel didn't just fall. It sounded like a door slamming shut on a decade of shadows as I took my seat behind Corbin, my hand resting on his shoulder like an anchor in a rising tide. The room was deathly quiet, a sharp contrast to the chaotic swarm of reporters outside who were still picking over the bones of our family name. Sarah Brennan stood and began the final evidence dump, her voice a surgical instrument that left the defense no room to bleed. She presented the definitive proof of Marcus Holt's serial fatherhood for fraud schemes, connecting the dots between Breyer's fake identity and the biological exploitation the ring had perfected. I watched the district attorney lean in as Sarah detailed how the mole inside the department had attempted to shred the Arizona files that very morning. They hadn't counted on my habit of keeping redundant digital backups. My logs had caught the tampering in real time. "Your Honor, we aren't looking at a mother and father," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on Judge Holloway. "We are looking at a manufacturing plant for leverage. The state rests. But this child's life is just beginning to breathe." Silence. It's the loudest thing in a courtroom when a man's life is returned to him. I felt the tension in Corbin's back, a rigid line of muscle that had been holding him together for months. Judge Holloway didn't look up for a long time, her eyes scanning the mountain of evidence we had built. When she finally spoke, her summary was scathing. She spoke for 15 minutes about the fundamental violation of a child's right to safety, her words falling like stones into a still pond. She formally terminated the parental rights of the woman known as Breyer Vane and the biological donor, Marcus Holt. The judge invoked the best interests of the child standard, her gaze softening only slightly as she looked toward my son. "Mr. Garrison, The law finally recognizes what you've known for 2 years. You are her father. Parental rights are not a weapon to be wielded by the predatory. How do you quantify the weight of a burden you didn't know you could carry until it was finally lifted? I saw Corbin's head bow, his shoulders finally shaking with a silent, tear-streaked catharsis. I kept my hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremor of relief passing through him. As the bailiff stepped forward, the cold glint of handcuffs caught the light. Briar was let out, her face a mask of feral hatred. As she passed me, she leaned in, her voice a low, venomous hiss. You think you won? Thane Vernon wasn't just some fool I groomed. He was in deep to Marcus's guys for gambling debts long before I ever met your son. He sold you out for a clean slate. I watched her go, but my eyes snagged on a man in the back row, a face from my own precinct who shouldn't have been there watching the ruling with a look of cold, calculating fury. The shadow in the back of the room still haunted my steps. The walk out of the Multnomah County Courthouse felt different than the walk, and the air was thinner, cleaner. But the shadow in the back of the room still haunted my steps. I couldn't shake the memory of that face. A cold fixture from my own precinct watching our victory like it was a personal insult. 3 months later. The Oregon rain had softened into a mild September drizzle. Adoption isn't just a legal filing. It's a soul-level correction of a biological error. And as I watched Corbin straighten Ria's dress in the quiet hallway, I saw a man finally reclaiming the piece of his heart that a thief had monetized. We were back for the final decree, the formal closing of a wound that had nearly bled us dry. The atmosphere in Judge Holloway's private chambers was intimate, a sharp contrast to the clinical brutality of the trial. Alara stood beside me, her hand resting on my arm while Ria explored the thick rug with a curiosity that made the heavy mahogany furniture seem less imposing. During the ceremony, my phone buzzed with a message from Michelle. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She had identified the man from the back row as a former internal affairs investigator I had forced out of the department years ago for ethical breaches. The grudge wasn't just professional, it was a decades-old poison that had found a new vessel in Briar's ring. I'm not taking her in because I have to. Your Honor, Corbin said, his voice echoing with a quiet, resonant strength. I'm taking her in because I'm the only one who truly has. She's been a garrison in her heart for a long time. Today the ink just catches up. The court-appointed advocate gave a glowing report describing a stability in our home that Briar had spent years trying to dismantle. Ink, it's so thin, yet it weighs more than blood when it's drying on an adoption decree. I watched Judge Holloway reach for a specialized silver pen, the metal glinting under the warm office lights. The scratch of the fountain pen on thick parchment was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in years, a rhythmic, final punctuation mark on my son's ordeal. Congratulations, Mr. Garrison, the judge said, handing the document to Corbin with a rare, genuine smile. You are her father in every sense the law and the heart allow. Corbin held the paper with a reverence usually reserved for religious texts, his eyes shining as he looked down at the daughter who was now and forever his. Thank you, Your Honor, he whispered, for everything. I felt an immense surge of pride, but my detective's instinct remained a jagged edge beneath my suit jacket. Can a man ever truly retire? Or is the badge just something you wear on the inside of your ribs for the rest of your life? The muffled sound of courthouse traffic filtered through the glass, a reminder of the world waiting outside. As we gathered our things and moved toward the door, I leaned down to adjust the stroller. My fingers brushed against a rough paper envelope tucked into the side pocket of Ria's seat. A dead drop I hadn't seen anyone place. I opened it to find a copy of Ria's new birth certificate. A thick, violent red X had been drawn through my name. I looked at the red X on the document and felt the cold steel of my old life pressing back into my palm. The adoption was finished, but the war for my family's safety had just entered its final, most dangerous phase. The walk to the parking garage felt like a tactical retreat through a sniper's alley. Every shadow, a potential threat, and every passing face a reminder that the red X on Ria's birth certificate was a live wire. I spent the next few weeks in a state of controlled hypervigilance, But today, I had to put the badge back on, if only in spirit. Justice in a federal courtroom doesn't move with the speed of a bullet. It moves with the crushing, inevitable weight of a glacier. And today, the ice was finally set to break. I sat in the gallery of the Portland Federal Courthouse, the echoing footsteps in the marble halls, a rhythmic precursor to the reckoning. Natalie, the woman I had known as Briar, sat at the defense table. The prosecution was relentless, stripping away her carefully crafted persona and laying bare the systematic psychological grooming she had used to hollow out our lives. A surprising detail emerged during the proceedings. Natalie had maintained a secret offshore account intended for Ria's upkeep, proving she fully expected to keep the child as a permanent anchor, even after the financial heist was complete. The judge's voice was like a hammer as he handed down the sentence. 15 years without parole. I watched Natalie's defiant mask finally crack her eyes wide with the realization that a decade and a half of her life had just been traded for a failed scam. 15 years. It's a start, I whispered to the empty air. But it won't buy back the time she took from my son. A prison sentence is a strange kind of clock. It doesn't tell you what time it is, only how much time you've wasted. Marcus Holt received 20, a heavy punctuation mark on a career of siring leverage for profit. I left the courthouse and drove toward the coast, the air getting cleaner as I pulled into a quiet veterans retirement home. Eugene Martinez was a man whose back was still straight from decades in the Corps, but whose eyes were clouded with the specific heavy fog of a man who'd been betrayed by someone he trusted. I found him in the sunroom, the smell of hospital-grade disinfectant lingering in the air. I told him about the convictions and the recovery of a portion of his laundered funds. For the first time, the shame in his eyes began to lift, replaced by the light of the afternoon sun hitting the metals on his side table. "They're going away for a long time. Eugene," I said, resting a hand on his arm. "You were the one who gave us the first thread. I didn't care about the money as much as knowing I wasn't crazy." He replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Detective. Redemption isn't a check in the mail. It's the ability to look at your own reflection without flinching." As we spoke, Eugene reached into his pocket and pulled out a small weathered coin. "It's a St. Gaudens," he said, handing it to me. "Natalie gave it to me during our first meeting. It's real." I felt the heavy gold coin in my hand and realized she'd made a sloppy mistake. She'd accidentally traded a real asset for a lie, and that single slip had led us straight to her door. I walked Eugene back to his room, but as I reached the lobby, I stopped. Outside, a black sedan with government plates was idling at the edge of the parking lot. Through the tinted glass, I saw the glint of a familiar face. The man from the precinct was inside, his eyes fixed on me with the cold, silent promise of a debt yet to be settled. The smell of slow-roasted garlic and rosemary shouldn't feel like a victory, but in a house that had been treated like a crime scene for months, it was the scent of a ceasefire. I stood by the kitchen counter, my movements practiced and calm as I peeled the potatoes for our first Sunday roast since the scandal began. The drive clear his throat, home from Eugene's home, had been a slow-motion scan of every rearview mirror, every intersection, and every shadow. But the hypervigilance was beginning to find its floor. I watched Alora move with a grace that had been brittle for too long. "Past the twine. Thane," she said, her voice finally losing that sharp, guarded edge. "Let's focus on dinner, not the front gate." I handed her the roll, glancing toward the living room. Corbin was on the rug, his face lit by the golden Sunday afternoon light. He was laughing a real deep-bellied sound as Rhea built a crooked tower of blocks. "He looks lighter, doesn't he?" I whispered to Alora, "like he's finally stopped waiting for the floor to drop." I'd officially filed the evidence against the precinct mole with the FBI that morning, ensuring the man in the black sedan would be answering to his own internal affairs investigation before the roast even hit the oven. I had turned the tables for good, and the satisfaction was a quiet, steady warmth in my chest. Steam rose from the gravy boat. For a second, it looked like the fog over the Willamette, but this time, nobody was hiding in it. We moved to the dining room, the table set with the good china that had survived the storm. The taste of home-cooked comfort was a revelation after months of bitter coffee and courthouse sandwiches. I touched the silver gravy boat, feeling its solid, cool weight. Midway through the meal, a silence fell over us. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind we'd grown used to. Rhea suddenly dropped her spoon, her wide, clear eyes fixing on Corbin. She reached out a small, chubby hand and gripped his thumb. "Data," she chirped, her voice ringing through the room like a bell. "Look, Data." Corbin froze, his fork hovering in midair. I saw his eyes glisten as he dropped his gaze to the child he had fought so hard to keep. "I see you, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with a deep emotional catharsis. "I've got you." Is a family defined by the blood that flows through their veins, or by the courage it takes to stand at the stove and cook for the people you saved? I knew the answer as I watched them. The real resolution hadn't happened in Holloway's chambers. It happened right here in the quiet space between a father and a daughter. As we finished, Rhea wiggled out of her chair and crawled toward the radiator in the corner. She reached into the narrow gap behind it and pulled Clear's throat, something out, her face triumphant. She toddled back to Corbin and dropped a small glinting object into his palm. It was his missing wedding ring, the one Breyer had made him believe he'd lost during her months of gaslighting. The house was finally giving up its secrets, clearing out the last of the poison. I looked out the window one last time as the sun dipped below the trees, and for the first time in 30 years, the black sedan wasn't there. Only the quiet golden light of a life reclaimed. The sound of the front door locking for the night was the final punctuation mark on a story that almost ended in silence. I watched the banking portal screen transition from a warning red to a steady rhythmic green, the digital pulse of a life's work finally returning to its rightful owner. I sat in the study, the digital ping of a successful bank transfer sounding like a chime of liberation. Corbin sat across from me, the light of the monitor reflecting in eyes that finally looked clear of the fog. Stephen Gallagher was on the speakerphone, his voice carrying a rare note of professional satisfaction. Through the federal seizure of Marcus Holt's laundered accounts, they had managed to claw back 90% of the funds Breyer had siphoned. "It's back, son," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Every penny they tried to turn into a ghost is solid again." Corbin didn't look at the numbers. "I don't care about the ledger, Dad," he replied. "I just care that she can't use them to find us anymore." Stephen then delivered an entry twist that made us both pause. The federal interest added from the seized criminal assets had actually left Corbin with a small surplus, a tidy sum that would serve as the foundation for Rhea's college fund. We spent the next hour reviewing the new legal safeguards, a fortress of trusts and alerts that ensured no single person could ever hollow out our lives again. Money is just paper and pixels until someone tries to use it as a knife. Then it becomes the most dangerous thing in the room. I felt the weight of the protection I'd provided, a heavy but necessary mantle. Later that afternoon, I carried a heavy canvas bag of coins down to my garage workshop. The smell of ozone and old metal met me as I fired up the induction furnace. I watched the fake gold eagles and lead core Morgans lose their shape, the microscopic tooling marks of the ghost watermark melting into an unrecognizable slag. The roar of the induction furnace was a cleansing sound, the sight of glowing molten metal, a visual representation of the truth, burning through a mountain of deception. "You look like gold, but you're just lead and greed," I muttered, watching the lies liquefy, dust to dust, lie to lie. Fire is the ultimate auditor. It doesn't care about your story, only your substance. As the metal cooled into a worthless gray lump, I reached for the very last fake coin case at the bottom of the bag. Inside, tucked behind the felt lining, I found a tiny real lock of hair, Rhea's first haircut. My hand froze on the cold casing. It was a final confusing fragment of a woman who was a monster, but perhaps for one fleeting minute had tried to be a mother. It was a piece of Natalie that Corbin never knew existed. I looked at the lock of hair, then at the orange glow of the furnace. I tossed the lock of hair into the furnace and watched it vanish in a puff of white smoke. finally erasing the last link to the woman who never existed, but whose wake we would be sailing through for the rest of our lives. The protection of the Garrison legacy was no longer a mission. It was a settled fact. As the metal hardened into a dull, honest weight, I realized the ghosts were finally gone. I stood at the edge of the Pacific, the salt spray stinging my eyes as I scattered the last of Eugene Martinez's ashes into the gray surf, the final debt paid to a man who died knowing he wasn't a fool. The sound of crashing waves against the jagged Oregon cliffs provided a rhythmic, mournful salute to a Marine who had spent his final days fighting a war he never expected to face in his own living room. The smell of sea salt and damp sand filled my lungs, a cleansing contrast to the ozone and melting lead of my workshop. Carrying out Eugene's final wish felt like closing a circle I hadn't realized was open. The recovery of his money hadn't just been a financial victory. It allowed him to die with his straight-back dignity intact, rather than in the suffocating shadow of shame. I reflected on how his small gold coin, the ghost that Natalie had sloppily traded away, was the single thread that saved my own family. To honor that legacy, I had used the small surplus from the criminal asset seizure to set up a modest scholarship in Eugene's name for children of veterans. You weren't just a victim. Eugene, I whispered to the wind, you were the first line of defense. Rest easy, Marine. The watch is covered. An entry twist awaited me back in my study, tucked inside a sealed letter Eugene had left with his estate lawyer. It contained a name, a silent partner in the precinct who had protected the ring's interests. My stomach dropped as I read the confirmation. The mole wasn't just a disgruntled investigator, but a high-ranking captain I had trusted for a decade. A predator doesn't go away just because you beat them. They just find a different forest to hunt in. By January, I had returned to my morning workout at the gym, where the Trojan horse had first entered Corbin's life. I moved through the rows of machines, my eyes habitually scanning the room for the time spills and the overeager smiles of professionals. I found myself watching a young man on the stationary bikes looking vulnerable and distracted, the telltale wedding ring tan line on his finger screaming of a recent divorce. Within minutes, a woman approached him, her approach too perfect, her smile too practiced. You think you're safe because you locked the door, but remember the person who sold you the lock might still have the key. I didn't intervene directly. I wasn't that man anymore. Instead, I pulled my phone and made a quiet call to Michelle. I'm at the East Side branch, I said, my voice dropping into a low, lethal frequency. Row 4 stationary bikes. We have a live one. Retirement doesn't suit you. Then Michelle's voice crackled through the line. You're still seeing the ghosts before they even appear. Maybe she was right, but as I adjusted my position, the woman I was watching suddenly looked up. She didn't look startled. She looked straight into my eyes and offered a faint, mocking salute. A jolt of adrenaline, cold and familiar, spiked through my chest. She knew exactly who I was, and she wanted me to know she was there. I tightened my grip on the cold steel pull-up bar, my heart rate steadying into a lethal rhythm as I realized the ghost watermark wasn't a signature of the past, but a calling card for the future. The war for my family's legacy wasn't over. It had just evolved into a much longer game. I stood in the doorway of the nursery, the soft glow of the nightlight carving out a world where the only thing that mattered was the steady rise and fall of a child's chest. The house was quiet now, a deep restorative silence that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in over a year. Returning from gym, I had performed a final mental post-mortem of the case I'd codenamed 120KV7. It was a textbook study in a new kind of warfare. The anatomy of the con was a triple threat: emotional grooming to lower the defenses, financial isolation to cut off support, and the weaponization of shame to ensure silence. We all missed the red flags initially: the aggressive refusal of medical history, the artificial urgency of investment windows, and the scrubbed digital footprints. They don't steal your money first. They steal your sense of reality. If the deal requires you to keep it a secret from the people who love you, it's not a deal. It's a trap. As I stood in the hallway, I thought of a secret I would carry to my own grave. I had discovered that the name Rio wasn't chosen for its classical beauty, but because it was the name of the lead forger's mother, a final hidden branding meant to mark my family as their territory. My son would never need to know that. You might think this is just a story about a bad marriage, but look closely at your own accounts, your own relationships. Are you sure you know who's holding the pen? I watched as Corbin leaned over the crib, tucking the blanket around Rio with a tenderness that made my throat tight. The smell of lavender and baby powder was thick in the air, drifting over the faint hum of a white noise machine. "She's sleeping through the night now," Dad Corbin whispered, turning toward me as I stepped into the room. The golden rectangle of light from the hallway caught the peace in his eyes. No more sedatives, no more bad dreams, just sleep. I rested my hand on his shoulder, feeling the solid reality of the family we had fought to keep whole. "Children are innocent." "Corbin," Batsun, I said, repeating a Vietnamese proverb my old partner used to say. "Children are innocent. They bear no guilt for the sins of those who brought them into the world. She was the anchor they used to try and drown us. But she's the only reason we learned how to swim. She was born into a web of digital ghosts and professional lies. But tonight she was just a little girl safe in her own bed. Blood doesn't make a father. Fear doesn't make a home. Only the truth does." We stood there for a long time, two men watching over the only pure thing to emerge from the wreckage. I eventually retreated to my study, the floorboards silent under my feet. I opened the heavy oak desk and reached for the cold metal handle of the bottom drawer. I placed my retired badge inside, setting it right next to the recovered St. Gaudens gold coin Eugene had given me. I realized then that my true legacy wasn't the thousands of files I'd closed or the criminals I'd put behind bars. It was the two people sleeping down the hall. I closed the nursery door and walked toward the stairs. The house finally silent. But in the back of my mind, I was already drafting the first line of the next file. Looking back at this family story, I realize I almost let my hunger for a peaceful retirement blind me to the predators circling my son. I was so focused on trusting the surface that I nearly missed the rot underneath. Don't make my mistake. Never trade your instincts for the comfort of avoiding conflict. The moment something feels off in your family story, investigate it. Your gut is often smarter than your hope. This journey of dad revenge taught me that protection isn't just about locked doors and security systems. It's about staying vigilant even when love makes you want to look away. The hardest part of dad revenge wasn't gathering evidence or coordinating with the FBI. It was accepting that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the person passing you the potatoes at Sunday dinner. My dad revenge wasn't about anger. It was about refusing to let my son's kindness be weaponized against him. The lesson is simple. Predators count on your politeness, your desire to avoid drama, and your fear of being wrong. Break that pattern. Ask the hard questions. Demand the uncomfortable answers. I believe the Lord's timing brought the truth to light just before the shadows could consume us entirely. Faith and vigilance aren't opposites. They're partners in protecting what matters most. Thank you for walking with me through every twist of this journey. I genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. What would you have done if you found yourself in Corbin's position, discovering the person you loved was a stranger? Your perspective means everything to me. If this family story resonated with you or made you think differently about trust, please consider subscribing so you won't miss the stories ahead. A gentle reminder, while inspired by real patterns of financial fraud and family betrayal, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling impact. If this narrative style isn't your preference, feel free to explore other content that better suits your taste.